Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of the Dialog Show. I'm your host, Josh Katzman. I shared a brief introduction on Dialog last episode, but for those of you who missed it, I'll do another quick intro on Dialog, and then we'll start the show. Dialog is a nonprofit whose mission is to help people understand the world. The Dialog Show is a weekly show produced by our team at Dialog. On the Dialog Show, we host conversations between prominent figures who hold opposing points of view. The way we do the Dialog Show is a bit different than other debate podcasts and live streams. Instead of hosting a live debate, we've created a unique format that gives both participants the time they need to craft thoughtful responses to each other's points. The way the show works is the following. First, both speakers record an initial intro that covers who they are and what their point of view is on the subject. Then each speaker asks each other a question about the topic. For each question, speakers can take as much time as they need to craft their response, giving them a chance to be both thoughtful and substantive in their answers. Once both speakers have established their points of views and asked each other their questions, then we set up a discussion that gives the speakers a chance to debate their points of view in real time. Our goal is to make the Dialog Show the best debate show in the world, and we're hopeful that this format is a good start. Now, format is not the only thing that's different about the Dialog Show. When we share our show, we do it both on Twitter and as a podcast and YouTube show. On Twitter, we break up the conversation in a structured format that gives people the ability to follow along with the arguments and comment on the parts of the show that they're most interested in. Overall, we're trying to create the best debate experience possible, so we'd love your feedback on how we can make the show better. Now, in addition to the Dialog Show, our team at Dialog is working on a tech platform that helps people understand different points of views on the world's most important topics. I'll share more on the tech platform in future episodes, but if you're interested in joining our engineering team to help us build out the platform, please head to our website at www.dialog.so and reach out. All right, now on to today's episode. We'll be discussing whether or not elementary school children should be taught about sex and gender. Our two speakers today are Connor, aka Counterpoints, and Aiden, aka SocDoneLeft. Both Connor and Aiden are prominent political streamers, and you can find their work on YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. Connor's perspective is that kids should not be taught anything about sex and gender in elementary school. He believes that kids should left to be kids during elementary school, and that if schools need to teach about consent and abuse, it can be done without explicitly talking about sex and gender. Aiden's perspective is the opposite. He believes that kids should be taught about sex and gender in elementary school, as he believes, based on his research, that this leads to better outcomes, like decreasing rates of child abuse and teen pregnancy. Connor will kick off episode 2 with his intro. So Connor, take it away.
Should children be taught anything about sexual education in elementary school, and if so, what should they be taught? I think elementary school kids should not have any formal sex education. I believe the main concerns from a conservative perspective are that children should have a period of innocence, a time protected from the adult responsibilities related to sex and violence. I also think there is a conservative concern that children are being indoctrinated into secular perspectives in relation to sexual activity, sexual orientation, and gender identity, rather than being given a choice as young adults. Finally, I believe conservatives are correctly detecting that some progressives want to use secular public institutions as a way to undermine the traditions and religious beliefs of their respective communities while bringing children into the belief systems of secular Americans almost like a new progressive church. Just to highlight my background, I am a centrist. I am very sympathetic to libertarians and conservatives who feel like modern American popular culture hates them. That being said, I also think that Democrats, liberals, and progressives have some status solutions to modern problems. I was raised by conservatives and feel like I have a good grasp of their beliefs and feel comfortable defending their strongest arguments. To expand on my arguments, the world is already a complex and scary place. Childhood is often the only time in life where people can focus on just making friends, socializing, learning about the world around them, and exploring the world from a perspective of relative innocence. The truth is that in the information age, with a 24-hour news cycle, with all the world's knowledge available through a smartphone, there will be plenty of time for young men and women to learn about all the horrors and dangers of the world related to STDs, sexual assault, toxic relationships, or the conflicts of becoming yourself. I think most parents want to protect their children for at least the first few years of their education and let them learn more simple things like letters, shapes, animals, colors, how to count, and arithmetic before bombarding them with the responsibilities of adult knowledge. I don't think it's public education's prerogative to violate the innocence of these children without the democratic buy-in of their communities. For my second point, I think that a lot of conservatives realize that school is a place of secular indoctrination. I'm not a religious literalist myself, but I respect the faithful and also respect that they will want to have some authority and input on the morality taught to their kids. These beliefs will vary wildly in a diverse society and will have particular beliefs on sexual orientation and gender identity. I don't think that it's the school's role to violate the responsibilities of parents or to teach contradictory lessons against their deeply held religious beliefs. I think that in middle school and high school, sexual orientation, gender identity, STDs, how to have healthy relationships, and how to identify toxic relationships and abuse can all be taught in a relatively objective manner that presents information to boys and girls to contrast with the worldview of their families. This presents belief about sexual orientation and gender identity as a choice being made by children who are becoming adults rather than inculcating a worldview that cannot be challenged one way or the other to children. It is the choice of these young adults rather than a rock-hard belief system being taught by a secular institution. While you can dismiss the indoctrination argument as a few fringe teachers in progressive states posting cringe to TikTok, it does seem that there's an aggressive push to use education as a vehicle to spread ideas about gender identity. There are elementary school teachers who are insisting on teaching children about being transgender or non-binary gender identities. There are teachers who are opening up the concept of gender as a social conception totally divorced from sex. This is a new concept and, frankly, in my opinion, completely divorced from reality. I have a 6-year-old son who wants to be an astronaut, scientist, YouTuber, paleontologist, adventurer, and if I were to tell him that he could identify as a gender associated with an animal or a cloud, he would likely do that simply out of a creative impulse to play with concepts. The truth is, though, that the vast majority of the population will identify with a gender that correlates with their birth sex, and for the most part, they're going to be heterosexual. We can carve out exceptions to the rule by making sure that homosexual and transgender teens are not vilified for their identities while not treating every child like some kind of Schrodinger's gender and sexual orientation where it's a coin flip every time a child is born. This is why I believe sex ed should remain in middle school, and these subjects should be presented as objectively as possible to adolescents who are making choices as they grow up, rather than as a rock-hard conception that contradicts the belief systems of conservative Americans. The separation between church and state was designed to prohibit the state from one religious view. I think that progressivism is increasingly taking on the zealotry and authority of a secular religion in the United States and is using secular institutions as its churches.
Thanks, Connor. Up next is Aiden, who will start with his intro and first question for Connor.
Hi, I'm Aiden, or SocDoneLeft. I am a socialist in the democratic socialist tradition. I'm a progressive, and I believe that sex and gender education should be comprehensive for kids, including some level of sex and gender education for elementary school kids. The arguments for this are 3: safety, culture, and truth. On safety, it's the oldest and simplest argument for sex and gender education. Kids need to be protected from each other and from adults. On speaking to protecting kids from each other, the vast majority of child sexual abuse actually occurs from children to children. We have to teach children, even children as young as elementary school kids, how to engage in proper touching, which is most of the time none at all. We have to teach kids properly how to engage in consensual behavior, because pretty soon they will be teens. In turn, we have to protect kids from adults, because adults do try to abuse children. And there's a lot of evidence that when we teach children what sex is, what consent is, and how to report abuse, they're more likely to report that abuse. They might also be more likely to resist it. There's a fairly influential study in this literature which shows that when children are taught what consent is in a comprehensive sex education program in a school, that school saw rates of reporting double the next year. That's not because the rates of abuse doubled in that school. That's because children realized what was happening to them and reported it to the school. The second part of safety is protecting children from STDs and teen pregnancy. There's just no evidence that refusing to teach kids what sex is, refusing to teach kids how to have it safely, actually improves their lives. When we look at STD transmission rates, they're higher in states that have abstinence-only education, which teaches kids not to have sex as the only way to be safe, or refuse to teach kids about sex at all. Teen pregnancy rates are also higher in states with abstinency, in a particular irony. So we don't really see that kids are safer or kept more innocent by refusing to teach them about sex. They just don't have safe sex. They're less safe. The second argument for comprehensive sex and gender education is about, in my view, parenting. There are 3 typologies of parenting that in the sort of classic typology. There's authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative. Authoritarian parents, when a child asks, "Why should I do something?" simply answer, "Because I told you so." Conversely, permissive parents will let a child do basically whatever. Then there's authoritative parenting, where when a child asks a parent why they should do something, the parent gives them a specific reason, a specific moral and logical reason for why they should do what they want to do. The point of authoritative parenting is to give children a moral core about thinking about their own long-term goals and pursuing it independently. There's a lot of evidence that authoritative parenting produces the most emotionally well-off and the most independent adults down the end of the line. So how does this relate back to sex and gender education? We should want parents who are willing to talk with their kids about anything. They're not afraid. They're not trying to shelter their kid. They will talk with their kids and reason it through. If the kid wants to have sex, if the kid wants to go out, the parent should be able to give specific reasons why, talking about their level of development, and the kid should be able to understand them. So the goal here is not preserving childhood innocence. It's producing children who are informed and empowered, and adults who are willing to engage that and make the children as empowered as possible. In turn, I think this is actually important for democracy. If you don't have this type of adult, it's hard to have a democracy where people are able to truly function on their own, truly choose between ideas. Last argument, truth. And this is the shortest one. It's a scientific fact that human sexuality is diverse. It's a scientific fact that human gender does vary from sex. We've observed both across cultures and across centuries. It's also a scientific fact that children can tell research about gender roles by as young as 3 years old. There's just no evidence, conversely, that teaching kids about sex or sexual abuse increases their anxiety about sex. So the harm of truth to me seems to be nothing. The benefit of truth seems to be that we can raise children who understand the world as it actually is and pursue it on their own. And that leads me to my question for Connor. Conservatives usually talk about children being sheltered snowflakes, but you talk about preserving childhood innocence. My question, what is the harm of teaching children the truth?
Aiden has some good arguments here, but I am skeptical of them because they feel kind of like a Trojan horse. You can teach elementary school kids about good touch, bad touch, private areas, and consent, all without talking about sexual intercourse or gender identity. Aiden does bring up that very young children can identify gender roles, which is true, and that is why most societies have a masculine and feminine gender role, and most people fit within those categories correlated with sex, endocrinology, and temperament. Part of the reason why I say elementary school kids should not be educated on gender conceptions of any kind is because socialization will allow them to play with these concepts without strictly enforcing them with the authority of the state. Girls can be girls, but maybe there's some tomboys who play with the boys more often. Boys can be boys, but if there's a boy who wants to play with dolls and hang out with the girls more often, you don't have to shove them into a category or teach him that he is some brand new conception totally divorced from his maleness or his masculine gender. Adolescents are flexing their agency and presenting these concepts to children who are becoming adults and leaving it up to them is an infinitely preferable solution rather than arming children who still believe in superheroes and Santa Claus with highfalutin progressive verbiage on gender identity. I don't think anybody worth their salt would object to teaching about good touch, bad touch, private areas, consent, and how to report abuse as long as it was taught at an age-appropriate way. But I also don't think elementary school kids should be taught about intercourse, disease, or non-binary gender identities while they're still imagining themselves as the reincarnation of Batman. I agree with the descriptions of authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative parenting styles, which is why I don't think it's the role of the school to approach children with an authoritarian or permissive style during youth. Instead, I think the school should work to be an authoritative source capable of articulating the strongest arguments of their constituent members, whether they be devoutly religious authoritarians or permissive, progressive anti-theists. I want to respond to your final question. What is the harm of teaching kids the truth? I'll respond with, I think that an age-appropriate truth can be wildly damaging. My son wants to be a military service member and a police officer. Should I show him body camera footage of dead bodies I encountered while I was on the job at the age of 6? Or should I tell him it's a very cool job that has a lot of benefits and the world needs good guys, but that it's something he can play with as an idea, but we'll have a more serious conversation when he's older? My obvious instinct is to say I should restrict his access to violence, even state-sanctioned violence, and I'll have an age-appropriate conversation when he's older. My response question is, what specifically do you think should be taught to elementary school children about gender identity and sexual orientation? The reason why I'm asking about these two things with the specific clause of that age is because these are the most contentious subjects in our society.
Connor asks me what specifically I think that we should be teaching children in elementary school about sex and gender. I think a good model for this process is the Netherlands. They start teaching kids about sex and gender at age 4 to 5, roughly when our elementary school starts. They start talking about things that are usually pretty abstract and not as specific. They start talking about feelings. They start talking about what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl. And they pretty quickly get into stuff like puberty, about attraction, about respecting each other. And they begin to discuss same-sex relationships. They begin to discuss sex around age 9 to 10. I think this is roughly the model that we should be looking towards. It is a progressive model that's also effective in teaching kids loving relationships, which is shown in the fact that Dutch people, when reporting on their first sexual relationship, 85% say that it was a positive experience. It's only 50%, 1 in 2 in America. People in the Netherlands, as a result of this long focus on consent, this long focus on understanding your body, have a better time with each other. Let me also fit my response to 3 questions that Connor posed to me. The first would be, can we split preventative sex ed, which means teaching kids like good touch, bad touch, from comprehensive sex ed, which includes stuff like what an organ is, what puberty is, what sex is? I think the answer is fundamentally no. You can try. You can definitely teach kids what consent is in the abstract sense. You can teach kids what a bad touch is in the abstract sense. But to give kids the specific tools they need to know what abuse looks like, to know when abuse is happening to them, to be able to build loving relationships going forward, you need to give them the details of it. I think that as you get younger, you get more abstract, and as you get older, you get more concrete. But you have to give kids some concrete ability to know what abuse is, what you can't touch, what's wrong to do. The second question Connor asks is, does teaching kids about gender override or mess up their natural socialization? Does it lock them into, for example, a certain gender role? And I think this just is not founded. As far as I'm aware, there's no specific research on the role of teaching in specifically forming kids' gender identities. But what we do know is that very young trans kids, we're talking 8, 7 years old here, seem to have more or less the same views on gender, the same ideas about gender roles as their cis compatriots do. They've experienced the same social system, they've experienced the same school system, and they've just decided that they fit into a different side of the great gender war. And number 3, Connor asks whether teaching children about sex and gender overrides the religious rights of parents, as if it were an authoritarian parent run by the state stepping in and stepping over the toes of religious parents. I think there's definitely a balancing act that has to be had here, but the balancing act should side with children being more informed, more empowered, and more able to have, in the future, loving relationships when they are older. We should be able to respect a parent's religious rights to tell their children what is and what is not moral, while also committing ourselves to teaching them the truth, just like we would commit ourselves to teaching them about biology and evolution, even if it violates the religious rights of some parents. The rights of a parent to religion do not extend into the realm of truth.
Thanks, guys. We will now enter the discussion section of our show, which will give Connor and Aiden the opportunity to expand on their perspectives and ask each other additional questions. Connor and Aiden, take it away.
Yeah, so to respond to Aiden's final position, this is why I love talking to him, is because it's always so refreshingly honest. I said that he could tell the parents to buzz off, and in a very polite way, he did. And this is the thing, like we live in the United States of America. I know some progressives don't like that, but like we live under a liberal republic. We do have individual rights. We have freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and we also have an attempt at the separation of church and state. And so as a result, you're kind of reinforcing the idea that there is a truth. That there's not just a truth, there's the truth. Something that should be taught by the state, in contradiction with the religious liberties and religious beliefs of American citizens, and you kind of just own that. So yeah, that's my first point, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so I am basically owning that. I do think like there's culturally appropriate and sensitive ways you could try and teach it, but I do think you should fundamentally be trying to teach the truth. And it is true, as far as we can tell, that, I mentioned we look across cultures, we look across centuries, there's trans people everywhere. There's even more gay people. It's really hard to ignore the fact that these are like natural human elements that are transcultural. So the denial of that. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to interject. Like there are of course like different sects of the Abrahamic faith who have different perspectives on homosexuality and transgenderism, and of course there's even sects of the Abrahamic faith. The reason why I'm bringing them up is because they're dominant in the Middle East and North Africa and the Western world, and I think it's roughly 4 billion of the planet's 7 billion population. So
it's a
I'm
pretty
just gonna,
successful religious group, yeah.
Right. So if we're talking about Jews, Muslims, Christians, and then of course there are Jews, Muslims, and Christians who are tolerant of homosexuality and tolerant of transgender folk, but there's a lot who aren't, and they root that in religious scripture And I think that they would view it as a violation of their religious rights to be teaching their, 5-year-old and 6-year-old kids, hey, if maybe if you're feeling a little funky about your body, maybe you're feeling that you don't fit into the social categories of certain genders, maybe you're a different gender, and then also, hey, do you like boys? Maybe you could kiss them. They got nice, soft, pretty mouths. Go ahead and do it when you're a teenager. Like that. That is like a violation of Abrahamic religious belief.
The argument I would give is that, in fact, a lot of Christians oppose not only the teaching of specific like same-sex sex education, but all sex education, because they think that it normalizes sex. They think that if you teach kids how to have safe sex, they'll have more of it. The data doesn't seem to bear that out. People who are taught comprehensive sex ed, if anything, have slightly less sex, and there's slightly the kids nowadays are having slightly less sex than they used to. So the wave of degeneracy is not approaching.
Yeah, but we're literally looking at the same problem and we're arriving at different conclusions, which I'm so happy you brought this up and we brought this up before. So I Googled it. I was looking for a way to own the Dutch. I was like, well, what is the Dutch birth rate versus the American birth rate? Because if the American birth rate is substantively higher than the Dutch birth rate, then clearly, even though we're couching all of our sexual attitudes in like religious dogmatism or zealotry or whatever you want to call it, or religious stupidity if you want to be mean about it, clearly like we're more successful or whatever. But then here's the problem that I bumped into, and then here's the final own against the Dutch. So I checked out the birth rates. We are only 0.15 higher than the Dutch. So even though we have a more religious traditionalist, religious tolerant society, we're actually not outcompeting them on birth rate. But then I Googled one more stat, which was the fact that religious couples on average have 2.65 children, whereas non-religious couples are coming in at 1.5. And so if we're looking at demography, and if we care about the future of the human species or whatever, it's like the stupid idiot, Iron Age religions are outperforming the degenerate, hedonist, pleasure-focused, sexual progressives. So on an evolutionary timescale, we're gonna outbid you.
That's actually something we see in basically every culture on Earth, that it's more conservative is like a small boost, and then more religious is a very large boost to rates of birth. I will push back on the idiocracy point. I mean, like, religious birth rates have been higher for virtually all of history, and yet Europe has secularized. America is still secularizing. Even the Middle East, which has some extreme, the Middle East has some of the largest religious coefficients on birth rates. Meaning that like the non-religious versus religious have some of the biggest disjunctions, and they're still secularizing. It just seems to be that as educations rise, as incomes rise, people get less religious, basically everywhere.
But then that kind of defaults to like the concepts of like American liberal republicanism, which I understand, like, I'm hybridizing a bunch of words, but what I mean by this is like republicanism is enshrining laws into the foundation and the fabric of the country. That way you propagate a society based off of those foundational laws, whereas liberalism is the tolerance of parallel structures of belief. And that's actually something that I think is kind of missing from your calculus, is like the liberal tolerance of exterior, beliefs, because you find them silly and quaint and stupid and counterproductive and toxic.
Well, so I think the question we're getting at here is what the burden should be on. So, for example, in the Supreme Court, the question for when it's okay for the state to override people's religious beliefs is when the state has a compelling interest to do so. That's like the standard questionnaire. You put it to the Supreme Court, and if you can be like, hey, overriding these people's religious beliefs in cannibalism or something is good because it protects people's right to life or whatever, the Supreme Court will probably side with that. So speaking purely in the terms of American republicanism, the argument I would give is that there is a compelling state interest in teaching kids about sex and sexuality because it prevents abuse, because it encourages safer sex, and in turn about gender and sexuality because it reduces rates of bullying. It produces more mentally well-off kids down the line. So the argument, in short, is like it's so beneficial to the children and to society writ large, the state has an interest in stepping a little bit on the toes of religious people. And I guess the argument I would give is like, I think that we mentioned earlier that all sex ed is to some religious groups completely anathema. And so the question is like, how do you decide where that balance is? It's not a question of whether that balance exists. It's where the line is drawn.
Yeah, and so this is exactly why I draw the line where I draw it. So I think that when it comes to teaching elementary school kids about, I think you have bitten the bullet that you think that it should be age appropriate, but There should be comprehensive sex ed introduced to elementary school kids, and they should be taught about sexual orientation, and they should be taught about gender identity as concepts. And I do think, like you mentioned, this is anathema to the Abrahamic views on, or at least some conservative Abrahamic views on sexual orientation and gender identity. So the reason why I put the line at middle school is because we're talking about budding adults. We are talking about people who are flexing their autonomy. They're becoming autonomous in a lot of ways. They're learning about science and chemistry and calculus and world history and all that kind of stuff. And so they're learning that their parents, who, if they have good parents, parents are the, hopefully like really positive role models and influences. And to a child's mind, they're the authorities on almost everything in the universe. Whether or not Santa Claus exists is almost completely reliant on, your parents' beliefs on Santa Claus. But you're getting into those conflicts. And I feel like to start the conflicts at an age and a time that I feel is borderline inappropriate is kind of like the state overstepping its bounds, because you're not going to budding adults and saying, this is what your family, parents, and community believes. This is what other communities believe. And as a result, as a young person who's becoming an adult, it is your role to assert your moral authority and maybe contradict the beliefs of your parents as you become an adult. And these are some of the options that are presented to you. They're presented as options, not as, authoritative ways of viewing the world. Whereas when you move that down into elementary school, I think it is an authoritative way to view the world.
Sure. I mean, so I think we mentioned earlier that younger education on sex ed is going to be, by necessity, a bit more abstract. It's hard to be age appropriate with very specific sex acts, and kids often might not even understand the specificity of like sex acts, for example. So I think that, like, I will concede a tiny bit that when you're trying to teach kids stuff about like gender and sex and whatnot at the young level, you would want it to be more abstract. And I do think that opens more room for letting this be not like the teacher is imposing this is the correct view on gender on you, but they're just trying to say like, hey, some people like when I look at like the educational materials, the best of the educational materials around this, what does it say? It says you might not feel at home in your body, but maybe you will. It says, why not wait and see? Why not choose among these options? And if that level of, hey, your gender might not align with your body oversteps religious boundaries, then again, those religious boundaries are just at odds with truth. And so I guess I would speak to this a little bit. The reason, so there's controversial history on this, but the reason for the reason that we have such a broad exemption around religions is in part to preserve the social peace. Like it came down to literally often in the old times, churches fighting each other. And so we wanted this really broad state exception so that religious groups wouldn't be at each other's throats. And so the point I would bring here is just like, I think you can preserve the social peace and teach kids that gender doesn't equal sex. I think that any group which is going to get so upset at that, they're going to break the social peace, is a group which will like have fundamental conflicts with the idea of sex ed in general.
Yeah. This is actually like, this is very painful and ironic for me, and it's not because you're not making coherent points, it's because you're making coherent points that necessarily like follow other arguments. So the right wing, and I'll try to keep it relatively on topic, but the right wing was extremely hostile to Middle Eastern and North African immigration, right? And part of the reason why, at least argued by I guess what you would call the alt-light, the enlightened centrists who were, they identified with right wing and they weren't racist, they more identified with the social fabric of the Americas and the Western world or whatever. Their argument was that Muslims, and conservative Muslims in particular, are fundamentally incompatible with Western civilization. They don't like homosexuality. There's a bunch of state-sanctioned homicides of homosexuals in Middle Eastern and North African countries, blah, 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 blah. I could go down the list of all their more strict dogmatic views. The great irony, of course, being that now Muslims are increasingly becoming a social conservative ally, where you have a brown minority saying like, no, stop teaching my kids about this crazy progressive baloney. And so I really do like this flop. But all of this to bring it back to, I'm going to call it the gender trinary, because I think that's what it is. You're basically saying, there's man, there's woman, there's non-binary. One, this is a new conception. Like I understand that you're saying like maybe you have, I don't know, some Filipino tribe or some Indian third gender or some crap that I've never heard of before.
The Filipino did specifically have that, yeah.
Right. So you have transgender people who have existed in the past, and then you have these third genders that exist in like Native American things or whatever. But I'm just telling you, like, you're talking about the social piece. You are breaching the social peace through state compulsion, which I view as a form of violence, in order to teach the gender trinary. And then what you're hoping is that conservative Abrahamic people will not make a fuss about it, and they'll let their kids just be taught this. And by the way, this is something that is fueling a conservative counter reaction that is having them pull out of public education and also want to gut public education because they don't view it as tolerant or permissive of their worldview.
I think there's truth to what you're saying. This is part of the fuel on the fire of the pullout of public education. But that one's been going on for 70 odd years now. Like, and I'm not trying to paint all private education as racist, but it kicked off in the 1950s. And then it came after sex ed and abortion, actually, because schools were like, hey, this is what sex is. This is what abortion is. And people pulled out. They went to private schools again. In the 90s, it was evolution until the Dover case. And so like now, yeah, it's gender. But if it wasn't gender, it would almost certainly be something else, I think. Like, I think that fundamentally, I think that there is no way getting around beyond, like, if you think these things are true, as I do, and you think that there's like a decently large group of children, 1 in 200 who will fall into the trans category, 1 in 20 who will fall into one of the queer categories, then you have some obligation to set up a society that those people can function well within. Like, that's a lot of people. It's like 10 million people.
we agree here, but we are drawing our lines at different things. And this is where I think that conservatives have a reason to feel alienated and attacked and feel like the public education system is designed contrary to their interest and all that kind of stuff. The reason why I say that is because my social compromise, which you as a progressive, give a progressive an inch, they'll take 3. Like this is something this is the argument from conservatives is like, what is conservatism conserved? Conservatism is just liberalism and progressivism doing the speed limit. Like, you're kind of proving this point because I'm saying let gay, which by the way, this would have been wild like 70 years ago. Let gay and trans kids get to be teenagers. They're not going to fit into the social fabric as much as like the cis-het, straight, white, or now increasingly brown, normie, whatever people. But, carve out a niche for them and say, hey, if you fit into these categories, it's not a big deal. And if somebody tries to beat you up for that, then you need to raise the red flag and say that's not acceptable at all. Like, that is kind of like the social compromise between conservatives and progressives that I think is doable and maintains the social peace.
So the reason I'm speaking to social peace is that the queer bullying thing was actually one of the big issues in like 2000 or 2010 conservatism. Conservatives argued that they had a religious right to oppose homosexuality, and if that extended to a few people going across the line, well, whatever. And so they opposed the anti-bullying statutes. I want to say one case went to the Supreme Court, but I'm totally blanking on the name. Like this was one of the major motives. And so you might say like, hey, conservatives are merely a few years behind the liberals. I tend to think that this is just, we're setting boundaries around the current social peace. It's not that you're not conserving. It's that people are moving left. The people are choosing not to conserve these social traditions because they're realizing, hey, I can be a Christian and I can love gay people. And I think you're going to see people say, I can be a Christian and I can love trans people. I mean, we're seeing it already. I think that fundamentally it's that people can keep the core of their religion, which relates to a metaphysical view on how reality works, and they can get rid of the social conservatism bits. That's what I think people will realize. Politics is downstream of like what the core they want to maintain, which is a connection with God.
Yeah, it's just it's painful because you're just the nicest, sweetest, kindest face, the most polite fella I've ever known, and yet you're just like giga chatting it. You're like, yep, I want to use state authority to get these people to be on my side, and if I got to teach their children something that they don't like, then tough baloney, conservatives. eat a peener, like that, and like I'm trying to be a little bit self-censorious, so I'm not
I
actually
get it.
giving
Don't
things
worry.
to people to believe. But that's where I think that the reason why conservatives and liberals and some libertarians and the people that I represent, the reason why they consistently argue for middle school as the place to introduce these concepts is because you're not violating the religious liberty of the adults who are trying to raise their children within a certain moral frame. What you're doing is you're giving budding adults the ability to make their own decisions. And you're not presenting it as cold, hard, stone fact. You're presenting it as alternative perspective. So, for instance, I live in Florida. It's one of the most purple states in the union. Creationism is not taught in the state of Florida, as far as I know, at least not in the schools that I went to and not as a part of the public school program. But what is taught is, hey, your religious views are fine. Have them at home. That's totally fine. We love you. We respect you. You're the best thing ever. I'll see you at church on Sunday. However, this is biology and this is history, and we're going to talk about these things that we believe science has verified. And so as a result, religious people get to cry into their pillows at night, and they get to say those damn wizards and witches at public school are telling me a bunch of blasphemy and heresy every day, but I have to get a good grade at school, but then I'm still allowed to come home and cry into my pillow about how the earth is only 5,000 years old and dinosaurs aren't real. And so as a result, you keep the social peace in that regard by presenting it as alternative perspectives, not the truth.
To speak to that, and I guess to move it a little bit towards sex ed in particular, would you then be comfortable with maintaining my program if the teacher at the start of every lesson just says, all of your religions, they're so good, every religion's so good, so fine, but this is biology, this is sociology, and we don't teach that. Would you be fine with that if we just prepended every statement?
No, because then we get into the age appropriate thing, because then we're talking about kids, and this is the same age. Like this is something that we have to address. Sorry. You can go first, but this is going to be a point.
A lot of the age appropriate stuff we're talking about is going to be fairly abstract. Like stuff like what is a boy, what is a girl, you can't get meaningfully into with like an 8-year-old in a classroom setting. That is something that the family will still have overwhelming control over. It's just not possible.
Can you give an example? Can you give an example? What would be an age, like if you were just to take a guess or reference some of the educational materials that you've seen from the flappy-headed Dutch, what would you say would be an age-appropriate introduction to gender for elementary school children? Let's just say like 5 to 8. I'll even give you a broad swath. What is the introduction?
What I've seen, and so I you can find like dumb TikToks, you can find dumb books or whatever. The stuff that I've seen that seems completely fine to me is stuff like you can like different clothes, you can like different toys. All of that's fine. The teaching, in short, that's age appropriate is these are just social customs. Choose freely, and that's like the meat of it. And it'll give a specific example. It'll be like Joan became John or something, and it'll be an example of a girl who likes overalls, who likes playing with boys' toys, stuff like that. So that, to me, seems completely age-appropriate.
Yeah, so you just literally just hit a landmine from a conservative perspective. But I love it because you own your stuff, and that's fantastic. So in the 90s, all right, back in the wildly conservative Christian traditional, like we were basically living under theocracy at that time, in the 1990s, the concept was that people can be their sex and be their gender and still express themselves in ways that are not stereotypical. So you had concepts like tomboys, or you had femboys, or you had this, that, the other. And what seems to have happened within the past decade, this is a destiny argument, but please let me finish it, is that we've isolated down 10,000 different micro identities that we've all said that it's all social construction, it's all just, beliefs, whatever, choose whatever you want. Whereas that is not what most people want. What most people want, or at least what I would say I want, and what I think a lot of religious, conservative, and centrist people want, is the fact that 98% of people are going to be cis. They're just going to, relatively speaking, identify with the norms and traditions and gender-associated behaviors of their assigned sex. And then there are going to be people who fall outside of the category. And there are going to be people who fall outside of the category and who still identify with the sex and gender of, male and man and woman and female. And then there's going to be people who don't identify with that as all, and they're either binary trans, meaning they identify with the opposite sex and opposite gender, or they're going to be non-binary trans, and they're going to be, they're going to be a freaking cloud or a wolf gender or a fairy or something like that. And so the reason why the openness of Joan became John is in the 1990s Christian theocracy that we lived under. Joan would still be Joan. She would just be a tomboy that played with frogs and wore overalls and hung out with the boys. And then maybe once she had her estrogen kick in as a teenager, she would decide that she still liked boys. And she would do that without thinking that she was a frog person or a cloud person.
Sure. And so this is why I think that we have, I want to say there's like 3 or 4 studies on trans kids. It's not a huge literature, but all of it seems to suggest that trans kids are basically normal in their views on gender. Like, they don't have a different view of what gender norms are. So, like, for example, when you talk about there's all these like stereotypical gender norms, some radical feminists have raised this view. They're like, transness is simply taking the most stereotypical elements of one sex or the other, and that's your gender identity. But we don't actually see that bear out in the trans kids. They don't have a more extreme view on gender or a less extreme view on gender. They're neither androgynous or super binary or whatever. They just think like the rest of the kids. So I think that
and hold on,
this is a concern. Go ahead.
Let me scratch at that, though. So what you're saying is they view the kids around them and themselves as largely correlating with these, like a masculine gender role and a feminine gender role, and then maybe they just don't fit in between. So if I'm hearing you correctly, they see the broad social trends, but they just happen to recognize that maybe they don't fit into the broad social trends.
I mean, that's my understanding. I can send you a few studies on this. It's been, I think, maybe 2 years since I read them. But
okay,
go ahead.
I want to articulate something, but yeah, actually, if you don't mind, I want to address this directly. So this is what I think conservatives, libertarians, right of center, traddies, everybody is concerned, is that my son is a lunatic. Okay, he's 6 years old. He likes jumping off of high furniture. He eats dirt. He, plays with RC cars. He likes to pretend to shoot guns. He likes doing weapons. I know. Yeah. He is the most. If you accept the term cis heteronormative or whatever, he is the most cis heteronormative boy who has ever existed on the face of the planet. He just is. But if I go and tell him like tomorrow, and I'm like, "Hey, buddy, did you know that everything that you do behavior-wise is just it's just a social construction, and you can do whatever behaviors you want. And as a result, there's an entire category of like non-sex specific behaviors that you can indulge in if you want, and you can pick whatever labels you want." He's going to pick those things out of a desire to explore what Sitch and Adam call, other neo-Nazis that I love that I associate with, prophilicity, which is the modern concept that you can pick like a profile similar to like an online video game where you're customizing your character, where you're making all of these like personality customizations, whereas previous generations of human beings, they were becoming what they were. They were becoming men. They were becoming women. They were figuring out how they fit within the social categories. They were deciding what behaviors they fit into, and they were deciding what behaviors they didn't fit into, and they were becoming the things that they were. Whereas prophilicity, if you kind of open up the gender conception so wide, then basically you can be whatever you want. And like the attack helicopters and the postmodernist language that everybody complains about, that starts to enter into the fray. So why would like I trust you in your authoritarianism and anti-theism. I think you're a very honest interlocutor, and you put a very friendly face on it. But why would any conservative or any right-winger or any centrist liberal or who sympathizes with right-wingers, why would they allow in the inch of, introducing the gender trinary to children when the mile is prophilicity and postmodernism and cis het straight lesbians? Why would they let that in?
Well, I think the answer is twofold. One, why let in the inch? Well, because if you truly do believe, as a lot of conservatives do, that trans people, it's just a phase, that it's all fake, it's all just mental, then you should think that raising your kid right, and you have the kid for half of the day, you have the kid for 3/5 of the year, based on the average time a kid spends in school, you should be able to make a kid, if they are just growing to what they were, that should be able to happen. The indoctrination of public school is not so strong. I work with young kids, and they're fucking morons who do not listen to anything you say. It would be so hard to indoctrinate them into being like a postmodern neo-Marxist. These are like kids are great, but they're so dumb. They're so dumb.
Okay, listen, I agree with you that kids are dumb, and I want to let you finish your point, but I'm going to have an objection here. Sorry, continue.
So the first argument would be, why let in the inch? Well, if you truly do believe that there are really strong sex-based gender roles, and that they're sort of innate, that transness is just a passing fad, then it should pass. The transness will pass. If we do get your kids into, like, if we're going to indoctrinate them into the transness, that should pass, because the sex-based roles are so goddamn strong. And that's just not what happens. So
yeah, and
you ask,
go
ahead.
Can I address this before you expand, because I don't want to lose it?
Sure.
So I disagree with you that public education is this passing, influence in people's lives, and parents have their kids for 2/3 of the year. The reason why I disagree with that is partially something that leftists would take objection to. Parents are increasingly having to work in order to survive. It's very common to have 1.5 jobs, 2 jobs in order to survive as a single person. And then it's very common to have households that either, the couples both have a job, or the dad is working 50 to 60 hours a week and the mom is working either part-time or full-time. That's very common. So as a result, oftentimes what's happening is exhausted parents are taking their kids, passing them to the other parent before they could go to their next shift, while their kid is raised by YouTube. And so as a result, what I would say is that school is probably one of the most stable influences in a child's life, along with pop culture. Our pop culture is insane. So if you have 3 parents as a kid, I think it's pop culture, public education, and the parents are increasingly less relevant, and you're arguing to make them even less relevant than they already are. So that's one point I want to get in there. Hold on, and then just 1 second real quick before we lose it. So right there, I viscerally disagree with that. And then 2, I think kids are wildly suggestible. I think that while they are dumb idiots who ignore you on a healthy chunk of things, I think that discipline, willpower, the ability to focus on individual things, the ability to learn, colors, animals, shapes, all that kind of stuff. A lot of those neural connections are made during youth. And so if you inculcate somebody within an ideology, they are going to largely believe what they believed as when they were children. As an example, just real quick, and then I'll wrap up. I was a Marine. I was taught at 19 that I am the defender of America. I'm fighting for truth, justice, and the American way, and I'm here to stomp on bad guys in order to make them cry, Uncle Sam, because they stepped on the wrong toes, and we should go kill them all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I still deal with that indoctrination as somebody who has been out for almost 15 years. So to say that indoctrination given to people with breast milk is not going to stick with them, I think is fundamentally incorrect.
I guess, so to speak to indoctrination a little bit, as far as I'm aware, there haven't been any studies on the specific effect of types of elementary school teaching on the politics of teens. So I can't say yay or nay, there's no indoctrination. But when we look to say the college level education, there's pretty much no evidence that there's studies on how left or right college professors lean, and then how left or right their students lean at various years. And there's no correlation between the two. Lefter college professors don't produce lefter students. The students at college just seem to get more left. And the theory goes it would either be some combination of education, increasing openness to experience, because they're living on this tight-knit, very diverse community, or some other third option. But so I can a little bit to
I can back up your argument. No, and I'm sorry for interrupting. Temperamentally, politics correlates with the parents.
So speaking to education, directly, I am sure that education has some effect on the politics of children. But the argument I'm trying to give is that the types of education you're going to get in public school are not going to be Marxism is the correct way, and we are gender abolitionists, and you must believe this, that, and the other, which is the type of indoctrination you're talking about in a Marine setting. And, I went to a Catholic middle and high school, actually, and I turned out, staunch atheist the whole goddamn way. There is indoctrination in these schools, but you can pound an idea into a middle schooler, a high schooler, even an elementary schooler's head, and it doesn't have to stick if there's other influences in their life keeping them the other way. I think even if it were true that this type of indoctrination were happening, it wouldn't be nearly so strong. And it's not. And I guess bringing it back to that, like the type of education we're talking about for gender education is like, you can choose your gender. You're not bound by the birth sex you had. That type of stuff is just not strong enough to indoctrinate people. And you know, last thing I'll say to this, I pulled up one of the studies. It wrote, quote, "This finding further aligns with a recent discovery that transgender children's gender development before social transitioning did not significantly differ from a group of age-matched transgendered children tested after social transitioning." That's a lot of verbiage. What does it mean? Kids before and after social transition don't seem to have dramatically different results. Even not just being like read a book about Joan became John, but actually changing your clothes, that doesn't seem to change people's views on gender and sex. So like, I think it would be really hard to indoctrinate children into this. Yeah.
Thank you both for a great discussion. For our last word section, both speakers will share a summary of their points and their final thoughts. Connor, you're up first, and then Aiden will close us out.
All right. So I had an absolute blast talking tonight with Aiden, but at the same time, I think he is a lot scarier than even he thinks he is. He's like, guys, nobody's going to be indoctrinated. Nobody's even going to believe me. Ooh, woo, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. But the truth is, why would conservatives give people, like Aiden, but there's worse people than Aiden. Aiden's actually the most rational and intelligent and articulate of them all. And he actually believes in some level of truth and he believes in some level of correctness. I think there's infinitely worse progressives who are, postmodernists in language. They're postmodernists in belief. They don't believe in gender as something that even correlates to sex. And I think giving them some level of educational carte blanche to talk to your kids about gender is a bad idea. I think it's infinitely better to present multiple perspectives to budding adults, so young people who are becoming adults in middle school and high school, than it is to try to indoctrinate people in elementary school with quote unquote the truth. Now, I also reject the fact that school is not a major influence in young people's lives. I think that school is absolutely formative, and unfortunately, in an increasingly economically disparate society, it's becoming more important. Parents, the thing that I was talking about, parents the dad is working 1.5 jobs. They're working 50 to 60 hours a week. They're taking the kid, and the mom is passing the kid to the dad while she's out the door to her job. And so as a result, an exhausted parent is guarding these children a healthy chunk of the time. And then the major influence and stability and knowledge that a lot of kids are gaining are two things: their popular culture and their education. So to just say that it's willy-nilly and the education isn't going to stick anyways, I don't agree with that at all. So again, I think we should be arming young people who are becoming adults with multiple perspectives, not necessarily saying that there is the truth, quote unquote. And I do think conservatives do have the right and the ability and are correct in being alarmed. I'll emphasize this one more time before we wrap up. I think Aiden is smart. I think he's well-intentioned. I think he believes in the truth, quote unquote. But I think that there are infinitely more nefarious people out there that would capitalize on his rhetoric and intent to do even worse things, quote unquote, for the greater good, for the state's interest, for a compelling interest. And so as a result, I'm pretty much walking away with the same perspective I walked in with, which is progressives are very nice people, but the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
In closing, I started with 3 arguments around safety, around culture, and around truth. I think all of these arguments have fundamentally survived and are much more important than the arguments that Connor presented. Let's start on safety. Connor and I actually mostly agreed on this one. He agreed that sex education, and even comprehensive sex education, might empower children, might empower young adults, and might empower adults to engage in consensual, safe sexual relationships. The main disagreement we had was not on whether sex education keeps people safe, but simply on whether it keeps people safe and there's any benefit of starting that in elementary school. Connor basically had 2 objections. 1, maybe it's too young, and 2, maybe there's nothing age appropriate. We should wait till middle school. And I disagreed. I think that when we look at the Dutch curriculum, I think that when we look at these progressive sex ed curricula, they have really positive outcomes. People report substantially better first sexual encounters in the Netherlands than they do in the United States. And a lot of that comes to a long commitment to ensuring that children and young adults and teens all understand the importance of consent and all understand what the fuck sex actually is. In turn, I think one of the most important reasons why teaching this stuff is so compelling is that it has a really big impact on reducing child sex abuse. If we want to keep kids safe from predatory adults, we have to teach kids how to report their abuse, how to understand they're being abused, and what to do about it. The second argument relates to culture. This is easily the most contentious one. It's where Connor and I spent most of the time in the discussion arguing about. Connor, in short, agrees that it's okay to teach kids about sex and gender, but he wants to keep it till middle school, wants to keep it till high school, because he thinks then there's no risk of messing with kids' brains. And he basically wants to call this indoctrination. I think this argument doesn't hold up. I think that on the converse, we should be wanting to teach kids as much as possible and give them these options. When someone teaches your kid that their sex doesn't have to align with their gender, they're not indoctrinating your kid and forcing them to choose another gender. They're presenting that as an option. It's, if anything, the opposite of indoctrination. If simply mentioning that option, like, made a child to be trans, then the child probably was not cis in the first place. So goes the argument. And the data, I think, on trans children mostly bears this out. When we look at trans kids pre and post transition, meaning social transition for these very young kids, we see that they don't differ substantially on how they view gender. They don't differ substantially on any of the things which would suggest, like, oh, this kid's been indoctrinated, they've been locked into the other gender. They put on some skirts, but they feel basically the same way as if they hadn't put on some skirts. That's more or less what it amounts to. The fact, when we look at people who stay persistent in their trans identity, when we look at people who stay persistent in homosexuality or heterosexuality, it's because there's something innate within them which is driving them to be trans, driving them to be cis. And that's why this culture of affirming and making sure that parents understand and will talk with kids about sex and gender is so important. We need to build a world where all people are accepted, including cis people, including sans people, trans people, straight or gay, all need to be accepted. That's the compelling state interest that we talked about. Lastly, I think there's just truth in the matter. Connor didn't disagree that transness, as far as I could tell, that transness is something essential to certain people across a huge number of cultures, that sexuality is something essential to people across a huge number of cultures. It's not something which is indoctrinated into the kids by the liberal teachers. It's something that pops up over and over again in different cultures, and we simply live in a time period where we've stopped suppressing that. I think it's important. It's important to teach kids about truth, and it's important also to reflect that truth in how we approach this. If a religious person feels that teaching the truth is at odds with their religion, perhaps they should consider changing their religion just a little bit. You can keep the core, you can keep God, but you should change your religion to be in line with the truth of the world, just like biology, just like evolution. So in closing to the closing, I just want to say thank you so much to the Dialog Show for hosting this. And it's always a pleasure to debate Connor, even if he wants to keep your kids uneducated buffoons. But seriously, I want to thank Connor, and I want to thank for this great format. I think the slower pace inspired some more thoughtful arguments, inspired a little bit more research, and I'd love to do it again, and I'll love to see where the show goes with this.
Big thanks to Aiden and Connor for a great discussion, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. As mentioned, if you're interested in working on our soon-to-be-released tech platform, please reach out at www.dialog.so. And we'll see you next time for episode 3 of the Dialog Show. Thanks.